Hello, everybody, and welcome to Some Patches Required, where we attempt to not only educate, but hopefully entertain you on the ever-turbulent games industry. I'm your host, Zach.
And I'm your other host, Aaron.
And today we've got our first guest episode of Season 2, so that's pretty exciting. We have Ian and we have James from Undercommon Taste on, and we are going to be talking a little bit about tabletop RPGs, but more specifically, we are going to be talking about Dungeons and Dragons today with them.
Yeah. We had the thought that, obviously tabletop role-playing games have been around for a lot longer than video games, but they haven't quite hit the same mainstream appeal of video games to some degree, even though we've seen a couple of shifts in that recently with really popular projects like Stranger Things obviously being one of them, and then other popular podcasts that can go screw themselves just a little bit because they're more popular than us, and no one's allowed to do that. Like, Critical Role and The Adventure Zone and a handful of others. But we figured who better to talk to about the appeal of tabletop role-playing games as well as how they relate to video games than a couple of people who host a podcast about that exact topic.
Yep, and I guess instead of us bloviating more here in our quick intro, we'll just say a quick thank you to everybody that is coming back for another episode in Season 2, or maybe you heard us in Season 1 or are deciding to show some love. We really appreciate you. Please like, subscribe, show whatever kind of affection/sharing capabilities that you're capable of. That's a really weird way of me to say all of this, so I apologize. But my point being, we appreciate you, and thanks for coming back. And if you're a new listener, thanks for clicking on the show. We appreciate it. And without further ado, we'll just let you get to the content. Ooh.
All right.
Ooh.
Time to cue the noise.
As promised, we've got two guests on the show today with, at least personally, one of my favorite podcast logos of all time, Undercommon Taste. James and Ian, do you both want to quickly introduce yourselves?
Yeah, sure. I'm Ian. I am one of the co-hosts of Undercommon Taste. And I just drew a blank, so what? Hey!
I'm James. I am also I'm the other co-host. Ian does about 90% of the heavy lifting. I am mostly color commentary and to distract him as best as possible.
James's job is to give me bad ideas.
Yes, this is exactly my job. It's wonderful.
No, this already seems like a winning formula.
Yeah, what's an example of a bad idea, if you're allowed to share that?
Let's see here. In our most recent episode, we were talking about incorporating food mechanics into your TTRPGs, and we were talking about, it was chicken, and James mentioned putting a Pittsburgh Blue on a chicken, and I'm like, no, we are not going to wave our chicken at a flame and then eat it. Cook your chicken, people.
Yes.
Food
is a
poisoning
good
is
idea.
awful.
Yeah, salmonella is a thing. Don't do it.
Don't do
Not
salmonella. You
recommended.
heard it here first.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
But I guess before we get too deep into anything, like whatever the fuck a Pittsburgh Blue is, I would go ahead and suggest that you guys let us know a little bit about Undercommon Taste. Like, what is the show? I mean, actually, I should pause and run back for 1 sec and say, first off, we're super happy to have you guys on the show. Thank you so much for giving up some of your time on this dreary, at least in my area, Sunday morning.
Oh, not a problem. This is fun. I love doing these interviews. They're a ton of fun.
it only took us 4 months to actually get everything straightened out to sit down together. So,
That's
schedules are
something that
crazy.
sounds so weird when you hear that on a podcast, but when you're actually like trying to make something like this work, it becomes like, oh my god, was that already 4 months? It flew by.
It's
but
just like
anywho,
it's just like, planning a D&D session is the main big bad evil guy of your D&D session is scheduling.
Yes. Though,
yeah.
if
Just
two more stars line up, Cthulhu will wake up and rise from the ocean. So, I mean, we're almost there.
Getting
weird.
4 adults with day jobs to find a time when they can actually sit down for an hour and a half and talk to each other. That takes some magic.
It does.
yes, this is 100% true. But would you guys like to run us through what Undercommon Taste, is? How did it start? What do you guys do? What do you guys talk about? Just in case our audience is not familiar with your show, because they should be.
Also, what is a TTRPG? I mean, I know that we both know, but it is an acronym maybe not everyone's familiar with.
So TTRPGs are tabletop role-playing games. The most popular one out there by a long shot is Dungeons and Dragons. Undercommon Taste is a TTRPG homebrew content podcast. We talk about creating content for your games. We talk about implementing other people's content into your games. We've started branching out and bringing in indie game creators and third-party content creators for Dungeons and Dragons to talk about their game creation process and their products and all of that stuff.
That is one of the great things about tabletop games, is as you can play a video game or something like that, it's always just whatever the programmers have put in the game, they've packaged it, they've sent it out. But when you do a tabletop game, you can sit there and you have your base rules, but you can manipulate and mold your world to your players, to whatever your inside jokes are, whatever your stories are. And that is the great thing. And so what we call this, when you start adding things that aren't necessarily like strictly by the rule books or strictly in the package story, that's what we call homebrew content. And so we try to bring up ideas and ways to incorporate this kind of homebrew content so you can influence and add more stuff for your characters to involve them further into the game.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially kind of like mods or add-ons for video
Exactly.
games, except no programming involved most of the time.
It's
Although there are
just-
some number
Yes.
crunching and
Yeah.
There are a
balancing.
lot of numbers.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's basically Nexus mods for your Skyrim account. That's basically what it is.
So
Hell yeah.
So on that note, and I'm sorry because this goes against what we said about a concise intro, but I just got to bring up the fact that I want to know if either of you know about this. So I started with Pathfinder, actually, and that was my first tabletop RPG when we were in college. Aaron and I were in college, and there was a add-on or homebrew for how to deal with sexual encounters between characters in different races, and there were stats and rolls and all this stuff, and I was just like, interesting. There's some truly crazy content out there. I mean, I bring that one up mostly because it's like I think that really shows how passionate people are about expanding the universe.
Very literally passionate.
Yes.
Yeah. Passionate lovemaking is something someone cares about.
Don't say that on the podcast.
I know in 3rd edition there were official books, and then homebrew modules of all kinds that deal with
there
that.
were third-party
STDs.
books.
No, they were actually in 3rd edition. They had the actual official D&D cover logo and stuff. I don't think they were third party. I mean, I saw just scans, but
I don't recall there ever actually being an official Wizards of the Coast product covering like sexual encounters.
okay. Then it may have been they just slapped the logo on a thing, because I had some PDF files for it, so I thought they were official at the time. But I could definitely see them being third party content. Then yes. But yeah, no, this is a hurdle that has been jumped over many a time.
Yeah. Unsurprisingly so, in a world where Mass Effect, people love it for the sex scenes, and I guess
which
Dragon
are
Age too.
the least erotic sexual
They
encounters.
really are.
It's just like it's like, you remember Plank from Ed, Edd and Eddy? It's like if you just took plank and other plank and just kind of put them together and made them kiss awkwardly, and that's about as erotic as the sex scenes in Mass Effect get. But we'll get to that in a sec. But just in the interest, and we will, just in the interest of kind of driving things forward. So what was your inspiration behind Undercommon Taste? Like, what was the impetus for you starting this project and all that fun stuff? Because I think it might align with why we kind of wanted to have you on the show.
Well, from my end, it was hating my job during the pandemic.
I can relate.
Relatable.
I was working in a sheet metal shop. I was a CNC machine operator in a sheet metal shop, and our shop was designated as essential workers because we were building parts for ambulances.
That is fairly essential, yes.
So,
yes, I would call that essential.
Yeah, we fell under the Department of Defense's essential workers category. But yeah, so I was there and I was hating everything because I loved the job. I hated the people I was working for, and that is something that you find quite frequently in that particular line of work, because there is a certain demographic that falls into that line of work. And let's just say that I am not in that demographic. I am politically, I am very different than most welders and sheet metal workers in Northeast Tennessee. Let me just put it that way.
That paints a picture.
It does.
I was gonna say, like, that is the most indirect way to say something that everybody knows what you're talking about.
I'm just let me just put it this way. I'm really happy that my last day of work was a week and a half before the 2020 election.
That also paints a fucking picture, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
So I think it's funny. I mean, you mentioned that being part of the reason you started your show. I don't think I'd say I necessarily hated my job, but it was a similar thing. We're a COVID baby podcast as well, so we can relate from that perspective for sure.
Yeah.
So what's the other side?
So on my end, I actually had a medical issue. So the long story short is I stepped on a splinter during COVID because I was going to go outside. Everybody was talking about, the COVID-10 and gaining weight because everyone's sitting on the couch. Stepped on a splinter, it got infected. I wound up losing half of my foot. So I was in the hospital for about 5 weeks and then rehab for another 3 weeks after that. So I was in this 2-month stretch of being under extremely intense medical care before sending me home. And my wife at the time had reached out to Ian saying that, he needs something to do because I was going kind of insane.
And James needed something to do.
I needed something to do and definitely some things to get my mind off some massive physical changes that happened with the surgery and things like that. So Ian and I are friends. We do a historical reenactment before this. And as we've said before, my job is to give Ian bad ideas because I come up with terrible, terrible ideas. And Ian makes these terrible ideas workable, which makes them fun.
Yeah.
Hell yeah.
I mean, even before we started the podcast, James was the person that whenever I came up with something homebrew, I would send it to him and say, hey, look at this and break it for me.
Yeah.
Everyone needs a friend like that.
No, I mean, it definitely helps so that at least when you're a DM, you don't suddenly in the middle of the game realize that this thing you've made is overpowered. And it's like, well, great.
That's
that
why
character's
QA
just going to kill everything.
Yes.
That's the whole reason QA testing exists.
Exactly.
Yep.
But yeah, so that sounds I mean, I'm sorry about the foot.
Yeah.
But hey, I'm glad that you were able to make the best of a bad situation. And I also have listened to a couple episodes of your podcast, and well, not just a couple. I've listened to a fair number of episodes of your podcast, and I really enjoy it. So I think you guys really honestly did make a good thing out of a bad
Well, thank you.
whole world situation and personal situation, and it's a good time.
Yeah.
Yep. And I think just to let everybody else know, why are we talking about tabletop RPGs? Well, there's an important reason we're talking about them, and that is because one, everyone here has played them, specifically D&D and some other forms, but I think, as we'd all say, they're pretty great. They've certainly inspired video games, which is the main topic of this show, quite a bit, and we'll get into that later on. But at least for me personally, I think that they're pretty underappreciated still, even with at least what I would say kind of like the big boom of them. And on that note, I'd just be curious to hear, Ian and James, what your perspective is on that, because it feels like around when Stranger Things season 1 came out, there was this massive interest in D&D specifically,
Yes.
because of its emphasis on the show. Is that a real thing in your opinion? Do you think that Stranger Things was the real pusher of that, or do you think it was things like maybe like the Adventure Zone and Critical Role and some of these podcasts / like Twitch shows that inspired more of that push?
Stranger Things was phase 2.
Yeah.
Critical Role, especially Critical Role, was phase 1.
Absolutely.
That was the first time that because Critical Role was one of the first actual plays that really got big. The Adventure Zone does predate them. There are several other actual play streams and podcasts that do predate Critical Role. One of the ones that one of the first ones that I found that greatly predated all of them was a podcast called Thursday Nights. Thursday Nights was, until they wrapped up last year, the longest running actual play on Twitch. They started.
Oh,
I can't remember what platform they started on. They started on the precursor platform to Twitch, and then they transitioned over to Twitch.
Mm-hmm.
And so they started on Twitch basically as soon as Twitch went live. And they ran until, I think, September 2021.
Yeah. Twitch really was a big,
shit.
Giving people that ability to be able to kind of host, for lack of a better term, so people could see. But things like Adventure Time, Thursday Nights, Critical Role, it really was preaching to the choir. Unless you already had an interest in tabletop gaming, particularly D&D, you probably weren't going to stumble across it unless you had just like a really enthused friend. Where something like Stranger Things brought in more, especially with that 80s nostalgia, got a lot more people curious, or people that may have considered playing it, or maybe played it once or twice in the 80s and they kind of dropped it and left it, gave them something to kind of check and come back into. And then also a younger generation started picking it up from there. So you do need kind of both halves. So you have the people doing actual play, so you can see the game played on a certain level where it's good, you have high production, and you kind of want to emulate that. But Stranger Things did start drawing in a lot more interest from people who probably wouldn't have played otherwise.
And I'm glad that you brought up that last point, because a large portion of these players are people who played D&D in the 80s and then stopped. And then they're coming back. And Stranger Things also plays pretty heavily into what's called the OSR, the Old School Revival or Old School Renaissance, where people are going back to the first edition BX or basic expert rules and building games off of that framework. So they're very rules light. They're frequently very lethal games, because you have small hit pools and you don't have a whole lot of leveling. But there's been an absolute explosion in OSR gaming. And I think that 80s nostalgia coming from Stranger Things has really heavily influenced the growth of the OSR community.
Yeah, to put it in a gaming term, like first and second edition, OSR second edition, are what you'd call in gaming Nintendo hard. It's those old 80s, 90s Nintendo games that are just near impossible to beat. The games are a lot more gentle to the players, especially the new players. 3rd edition, 4th edition, 5th edition, where story building is more prevalent in the game than just straight outright combat. Those first couple editions of D&D, it was prepare 3 or 4 characters because they're probably all going to die.
Yeah. To give a gaming example, a video game example, D&D 5th edition is World of Warcraft retail. The OSR is WoW Classic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think
Zach would get that much more than I would.
yeah, that's the WoW player here. Wow,
Yeah.
Andy. Interesting question on that. So I had someone explain the origins of D&D to me, and I haven't ever really looked it up, but my understanding from what my friend told me, and it's sort of seems like it is the case from what you're saying, is that D&D was actually made as a, if I remember correctly, like a mod to tabletop war games.
Yes.
And it was much more originally about going into a dungeon and getting loot for your character, and the story was secondary.
Absolutely.
It was, like you said, a lot about the combat and being hard and the tactics of it. It was not very much about like, hey, I'm a bear that uses illusion to appear to be a human, or whatever, like the
Right.
famous Reddit thread thing is. That's absolutely ridiculous.
Sir
Yeah,
Barrington.
it wasn't
yes.
about that. Oh, that. So I was right. It was
Yes.
there. But yeah, so that is true. That my friend's not lying to me this whole time.
Yeah,
No, that
yeah, that is pretty accurate. World of Warcraft, not World of Warcraft. Dungeons and Dragons arose from, I believe it was a game called Chainmail, which was a fantasy war game. And so the original, the early D&D players were all war gamers, and that's why it's a very crunchy, very lethal system in the early days. And as it expanded and as it grew and as it became more focused on the role play, it sort of softened a little bit as it grew. Not to say that it isn't still a glorified combat simulator, because it is.
It really is, but I mean, and if you want to look into glorified combat simulators, there's still plenty of those. Warhammer is a wonderful example of that. You have 40K, which is more of a sci-fi, and fantasy, which is obviously fantasy, but I mean that is about fielding armies and throwing dice on the table and huge explosions, and that in itself is a very complex and expensive but wonderful game.
And
Yeah, I can express the expense. I love the mostly fantasy. I love specifically Total War, Warhammer.
Yes, they did a wonderful
but,
job with
40K
that.
is cool too. Yeah, especially if you don't want to like pay tons of money for a Necron set that you never end up putting together because your friend glues one of your things wrong.
Yeah. So I had friends that were playing Warhammer, and I had fielded a smallish Necron army. It was probably like 700 points worth of stuff, so a couple $100. And I very much learned I enjoyed painting the minis, which was great. I need to get back into that. But about the time I had my army collected and fielded, it was about the time everybody stopped playing, and I was like, damn it.
Well, that just sucks. So I mean, I guess, do you guys have any like specific tabletop RPGs that you prefer? Because I mean, for myself, I can relate to something we were talking about earlier, saying that these pop culture influences bring people in. I'd always been interested in D&D, but I'd never really played because I didn't have the enthusiastic friend that you mentioned. So actually it was the Adventure Zone that brought me into it, because, I like the McElroys. They're funny and zany, and they don't play too hard with the rules. So they're more interested in the storytelling aspect than the original, like you were saying, super crunchy, super brutal, prep for characters sort of thing. So that's what brought me into it. But until I'd started playing, I hadn't had that enthusiastic friend to bring me into it. So, do you guys have preferred ones that you specifically like to play, or do you have any recommendations for people who might want to get into it? Like, what's the best onboarding game for people who might be interested in getting started in the world of tabletop role-playing games?
oh, that's a question.
Yes, it was.
I think
I like 5e. I do. It is a good system. If it wasn't a good system, you wouldn't have so many people building on the bones of it.
Yeah.
It is.
That's a really interesting point, actually.
Yeah.
Because the framework has to be there in order for people to want to manipulate it around the framework. And so, okay, sorry, that just was that struck me as just a very interesting point.
Right. I mean, it's almost to the point where it is too good at that, because you have lots of people who are building basically 5th edition mods to change the genre of the game instead of going to a different game that's already in that genre that exists.
Yeah.
So like, I want to make my, a survival horror D&D experience. And he's like, well, then just go and play a survival horror game. There's dozens of them. You go play Apocalypse World if you want a survival horror thing, instead of taking all this time to modify 5e. But it's become such a big player in the TTRPG sphere that lots of people are coming in starting with 5th edition. And so by making a mod that's built on the 5e chassis, it makes it very easy for those players to go and play a different sort of game, because they already know the mechanics. They don't have to take the time and learn a new system, even if the other system actually works better for the genre that they're trying to do, or is easier to play than 5e because there are fewer roles or what have you.
Right. Yeah, and a lot of people just jump into D&D, and even within D&D, people get sunk into, a certain edition. And so with even those changes can be difficult. But there are several out there, and there's a handful that I want to play. I just, haven't had a chance to really get my hands on. That said, D&D, as far as a lot of tabletop gaming, is really accessible, because the only thing you really need to play is a set of dice, or you don't even really need the dice anymore if you have a dice roller like on your phone or something like that, or you have a friend that can lend dice. It can be very inexpensive to get into, where a lot of the other games can, again, have more of a cost barrier involved. That said, tabletop games can be things like card games or things like that. There's been several of those coming out, which again, you can get for like $5, and here's a set, and you kind of go through. If you're really curious about it, really go into your local game shop and spend 5-10 minutes, talk to the person behind the counter and say, this is kind of what I'm looking for. And they can point you in all kinds of wonderful directions.
But yeah,
Hell yeah.
But you got...
I was going to say, but I just need to add this caveat. The dice are very
fun.
The
dice are extremely fun.
Dice
yes.
are very
Dice are fun.
My bag of dice for playing D&D is within 2.5 feet of me right now. And my 5e player's handbook, because I'm still kind of a neophyte, is within 4 feet of me. So it's fun to have those physical aspects to it. But yeah, it's definitely a lower cost of entry to do it with a digital situation, even using something like Roll20.
Yeah. And just about everything for 5th edition is on the internet for free somewhere.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So you don't actually have to buy the books if you're willing to do the little bit of legwork to hunt down the content. But yeah, you can literally play for free. You set up a free account on a virtual tabletop site like Roll20. You use a digital dice roller. They have one built into the site. You can download a form fillable PDF of the character sheet, or there are some character sheets that are actually built into most of your virtual tabletops, so that's for free. All of the content is available online for free. You can spend as little or as much as you want to play a game like Dungeons and Dragons. I was just doing the math the other day. I happen to have like $2,000 worth of 5e books that I've collected over the last 6 years.
Hachi-machi.
Because when a new book comes out, I buy it, and it's a $50 book. But you don't have to do that. There's more content on my shelf than I am probably ever going to use in actual games. you don't have to buy that.
Right. And at that point, a
Yeah.
lot of the books
Yeah.
become, like the Funko Pop collections and things like that, where you have it just to round out the collections, not necessarily because you ever possibly intend to use it. That said, a great thing about the books, and one thing that brought a lot of people in as we talked to our interviewers, are the art for the books is one of those things that drew a lot of people into the games. And the art is generally pretty fantastic 90% of the time. And so, I mean, if you want a good coffee table book, those can be some really fun things to have out with diagrams and again, just the general monster art or the art in general for the books can be a really neat thing to have.
Yeah, the artists that work on the game are absolutely phenomenal. And it's funny because I didn't realize how much art actually mattered until I got, I think it's called Soul Forge, this new card game that's kind of like Magic, but hopefully cheaper. And I was looking at the art for it, and it is just not very good. The cards look so dated, and I was like, God, art matters a ton for how enthusiastic you are for something. It's kind of crazy.
It gives a ton of polish.
Yeah, no kidding.
And the interesting thing for me about that is that it also is really interesting that they put that much work into the art and that much time and that much effort and that much expense for something that is very interpretive. It's all about imagination. It's what can you conjure up in your own mind in these games within this world that is based on the framework. But the art is still such a huge draw because that visual component is important.
Oh yeah, and like I said, we've talked to so many people that have gotten the games because they were younger or whatever, and they saw the art in the books and they picked it up and started reading, or they just got hooked in, and that art really is. I mean, people who poo-poo or make fun of art majors or whatever. I mean, art is a huge influence just in everyday life. So.
Well, talking about what we just did, I think brings up one of the big questions for me that I've always found frustrating. I was actually very hesitant to mess with 5e for the longest time. Everything I DM'd was either Pathfinder or the Genesis system, which is a fantasy flight system, which focuses more on like role-playing and social aspects. The combat in it is actually kind of weak, in my opinion. But why do both of you feel that the D&D has been so successful to the point that people may not even I mean, D&D is almost synonymous with tabletop RPG. Some people I've heard refer to the genre of RPG games like D&D as all being D&D, kind of like people that are like Coke is every soda. It's like it almost encompasses the whole genre. And we found a link earlier. I think it's like D&D is 54% of the games that people are playing.
Oh, yeah,
the next highest one is like Call of Cthulhu or something at 10%. Like,
yeah,
people are really mostly playing D&D.
Right. And I think it's a combination of things. Part of it is that D&D was in a place to capture the market when it came out. And it established itself as the TTRPG, even if their player base was substantially smaller than it is now. It cemented its place as the foundation for TTRPGs. I mean, yes, there were other games that were coming out in that early period. Traveler is a big one that I can think of, which is a sci-fi based game that came out at roughly the same time as Dungeons and Dragons, but they thoroughly cemented that place, and then they got all of this free press during the Satanic Panic.
Yeah, there is no such thing as bad publicity, as they say.
And so by bringing out D&D specifically during the Satanic Panic, it established Dungeons and Dragons as a cultural touchstone. It was a game that everyone had heard of, even people who didn't play it. And so it became that basis that everyone could reference, even if they weren't involved in the game.
Right. It became like, Sony's Walkman, not every personal cassette player was a Walkman, but everybody called it a Walkman because that's what everybody knew it by. So if you wanted to play,
not all facial tissues are
right.
Kleenex.
So if you wanted to play a tabletop game and you didn't know, well, I'm going to go play D&D because that's all you knew was out there.
And for a slightly more cynical approach, modern D&D, I can give you a one-word answer as to why it is so popular, and it is Hasbro.
Yeah.
Because Hasbro owns Wizards of the Coast, and so Wizards of the Coast has Hasbro's advertising budget.
And that is nothing to sneeze at.
Well,
no.
Online, we were looking at this article that I was referencing, Aaron and I.
Yeah,
I
pulled it up.
Oh, cool. Yeah, we were reading through it, and one of the things to mention too is like, even with the popularity growth, it's still a pretty niche audience. There's really not that much or that many people that, it's not Call of Duty, right?
Right.
And also, when you're playing a game, like some people do have multiple campaigns running at the same time, but like it takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of time. My sessions typically are like 4 hours long once a week, and that's enough for me. So it really can only commit to one game at a time. And if your group keeps playing for years at a time, like there was some YouTube video I watched where a guy had a campaign going for like 20 plus years.
That's
like,
insane.
There are a couple of games that are known in the community. One of them is a game that has been the same group of people continuously playing for 43 years. They started in first edition.
Really?
Yes, they started in first edition. It's the same world. It is the same campaign, and they just, as one of their characters hits max level, they just retire them and pick up an apprentice or whatever that character had, and they just keep going with the new character.
Absolutely crazy.
That is crazy.
Yeah.
That is some Boyhood shit. If Boyhood was 43 years.
Right? Yeah. But yeah, like you were mentioning, by some accounts, and it's hard to get an accurate count because of the nature of tabletop games. D&D 5e, by some accounts, has 50 million players worldwide. And that sounds like a lot, and it is a lot. But then you compare it to a game like Fortnite. Fortnite has 270 million players around the world.
Right.
They have 25 million players that log in every single day.
Small indie company.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. So
Epic Games, humble indie company with no bad track record.
None whatsoever.
Really just a story about the young, scrappy kids making a game work. Epic Games presents Fortnite, the story of the underdog.
But yeah, so yes, it is big. Yes, there are lots of people who play it, but it's not nearly as popular as many of the modern video game franchises are.
Right.
And largely, I think you hit it on the head that it's the time commitment. That's the largest thing. You can log into Fortnite, play a couple matches, be done in 20 minutes, and go on with your day. You can't do that with D&D.
No, but I will say one thing that has made it easier, and we saw this a bit more with the whole COVID thing, is the virtual tabletops getting more traction. And it does make it easier to get friends together, at least online, to play versus having to everyone have the same amount of time off and get everyone in the room together, which can be a huge hurdle in itself. It's much easier to virtually connect. And so you start seeing these virtual tabletops. Now you're kind of getting a blend between tabletop RPG and video game-esque because, again, you're not physically there. But this has also another thing that's made the games more accessible.
Yeah, I mean, so we did an actual play for our 2nd year anniversary for our podcast. And our players, I was running it. James was one of the players. He lives about 45 minutes away from me. Then we had a player in Atlanta, a player in Chicago, and a player in Birmingham, Alabama. You can't do that traditionally in person because, just how far away everybody was. Everyone would have had to drive like 7-8 hours for us to meet in person to play a game. And people just aren't going to do that. But because of the way that virtual tabletops work, we can all just hop in to a Discord session, pull up Roll20, and we're playing together in a matter of minutes.
Yeah. And if you do theater of the mind, it's that much easier.
It really
too.
is.
You don't necessarily need the visual stuff,
Right,
even though I love it.
No, it's super useful, and I think that's actually like not to transition too hard or too sharply from what we were talking about, but I think that kind of, as we're more moving towards the virtual space, I think it's kind of time to bring up influences and whatnot on the video game world. So, if you wouldn't mind just briefly letting us know what your experience was with like different video games individually, because video games owe so fucking much, starting back at fucking Zork, to D&D and tabletop role-playing games and just about everything in that realm. But we would be remiss not to try and talk about that, because part of this whole conversation is just bringing to light how much these games have influenced video games, which are bizarrely way more well, not bizarrely, there's several reasons, but way more marketable than tabletop role-playing games. So what are your histories with video games individually, if you don't mind?
All right, I'm gonna be old. I think my first RPG,
Zork.
Yeah, I played Zork later. Actually, I played Zork after I was in college, but again, and I was in college in the early 2000s. I think
it happens.
The first,
we all get to Zork at some point.
The first like RPG game I played was probably, and can't for the life of me, I can't remember the title, but it was a D&D backed game for the old Nintendo Entertainment System. But the first thing I've played where I actually got a feel for like the character building and the mechanics was Fallout 1 and 2. Very much built off of that tabletop thing. You have the special, you have your armor class, you had your roll to hit, things like that. And then early Neverwinter Nights, where you actually, depending on how you had the game set up, you could actually see the dice rolls under the chat window where it'd go, and it would show each dice roll for each time you tried to hit or break something, or each attack. And so these were two really strong fundamental games that were hugely popular, that borrowed extremely heavily off these D&D and tabletop mechanics.
Yeah, so I didn't really get into video games a whole lot until after I got into college, just because of where I lived, and I grew up on a farm out in rural Southwest Virginia, so I didn't have friends to go and play with because my closest friends were like 2 miles away. And so, the first game that I got was Pokemon Silver, and I bought a Game Boy Color specifically to play it.
I actually have a Game Boy Color version, and the battery has died, so it can no longer actually save anything.
Yeah.
So unless I want to keep my Game Boy running constantly, I cannot beat Pokemon Silver.
Yeah. But so the first console that I ever got was a GameCube. I was a pretty big into the Nintendo games, Soul Calibur 3 and Super Smash Bros. Melee. Those were my two big ones. Nice. We used to play Melee all the time at school. Whenever we had a day, whenever we knew that there was going to be a substitute or anything, you bring the GameCube into school with you, and we plug it into the TV and we play Smash Brothers all day. It was glorious.
Fuck yeah.
Hooray, public school system.
Yeah.
I ended up, I bought my first Xbox with my graduation money from high school and got Morrowind, and was absolutely hooked on the entire Elder Scrolls franchise from there on out. So yeah, I love Elder Scrolls. I love the Fallout series. I cannot get into the old Fallout series 1, 2, and Tactics specifically because they are based off of that old D&D style turn-based system that is so lethal and has such a steep learning curve.
Yeah.
It's too steep for me to have fun.
Fallout will chew you up and spit you out.
Yes.
Yeah, which Which actually brings up another interesting question that I'm fascinated by, because I'm actually really glad you brought this up, because one of the things that we were really interested in when we were, coming up with this topic and thinking about collaborating with you guys was the translation. Because like you said earlier, video games are defined to some degree. I mean, like, you can talk about patches, you can talk about DLC, you can talk about, mechanical tweaks and everything that comes with being alive in the age of the internet. But there is something immutable about a video game where the experience that you buy in the package is the experience defined. And it seems like there's something lost from the translation, especially for something like so many early video games were, that was so clearly basing itself off of tabletop role-playing game mechanics, that is lost there. So how well do you think that translation works? It seems like probably not too well. Or is it just the specific iteration of the mechanics from the more brutal versions of it? Like, what do you think gets lost there in the translation from something where you can do a homebrew to something where we're using this mechanical base, and then we're going to let you just kind of work within our framework, which is a framework based on a different framework? So
there is something so if you're DMing a tabletop game and it's story driven, as you'd say, or you want your characters to go from point A to point B to point C without any kind of extraneous pathing or storytelling thing, they call that railroading, where you're driving them to this point. And so if you're playing a video game, your story is going to be railroaded, yes, but still, even then, as you play this game, at least I do, and I've heard a lot of other players talk about this too, when you're immersed in the game, you're still building up, the world in your own mind. So what conversations happen, what's going on, if you're slighted by an enemy, especially something like Fallout, where you do have, your morality is very ambiguous. You can be a hero, you can be a villain, you can do whatever you want. So you go through, and are you saving the town? Why? Did you get mad at that one NPC for absolutely no rational reason because you're having a bad day, so you decide to shoot the NPC and off them, and then you wind up, the whole town vilifies you. So you build up this story in your head of why this may or may not have happened. So this kind of, theater of the mind still happens to a point within video games. So in that respect, I think that a lot of that tabletop atmosphere still kind of gets carried over as well. It's different, but I still think it does translate to a point.
I think the biggest issue that you run into when trying to translate a tabletop system into a video game is that video games run on programming, and programming runs on memory, and you only have so many options that you can program in. You have to railroad to an extent, even in the most open game that you can think of, until we can get to a point where we are playing games that are completely in the cloud and run by adaptable AI that can literally respond to whatever stimulus you give them. Video games are going to be limited compared to what you can do in a tabletop game.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think,
yeah, by their very nature.
Yes.
I think the one thing to expand on that is the interesting thing with some games that have tried to replicate some of that, infinite possibility, they end up being pretty shallow, because when you deal with like procedural generation or templates or any of that, you really lose a lot of the magic of having like handcrafted environments or handcrafted stories that can be really finely tuned to, deliver a certain experience. You lose that a lot. Like, we talked about Elder Scrolls, right? And I think, is it Daggerfall that's technically the largest game that's ever been made? But it's like half of the things in that game are, you're not necessarily getting any value outside of the fact that it's kind of cool to bring up that Daggerfall is an old game and it also has a ton of content. Like, we had a episode, this is an old one from season 1, where we talked about like open world games. And it's like, not everything should follow that format. If you've got a, it's like a mile wide, but a centimeter, or a mile wide, but a centimeter deep kind of thing. It's like, that's not always the right way to do stuff. I feel like part of the interest in that open world approach, and even games developing RPG mechanics, is to maybe steal some of the magic that can come from that feeling of D&D. Not that that's what the players are necessarily like drawn to those mechanics for, because a lot of them haven't touched a tabletop RPG, but I don't think it always works well for every single type of game.
No, it won't.
Yeah, and I also think that there's a like, again, by I say, like, when I say by their very nature video games are limited, it's because there is a human bandwidth issue. And it's something Zach and I have talked about on the show before, but there is a very literal human bandwidth issue where so I used to tutor programming when I was in college. And there were people I'd be like, okay, so pitch me your dream game. Let's talk about that, and let's find like a super stripped down version of what you want to make that is feasible for someone who doesn't even know how to program yet. And usually it's like, well, I want to make a game that's D&D. And I said, that's literally impossible.
Yeah.
Because even if you had a AAA budget and a network of studios like Ubisoft, where every Assassin's Creed game has one flagship studio and then like 37 support studios, you still only have so many artists, you still only have so many programmers, you still only have so many anything, sound designers, cinematographers, texturing people. You don't have enough people. There are not enough people in the world to encompass what can be achieved just with imagination. And I think that's where games like D&D and other tabletop RPGs really thrive, is the fact that our own imaginatory bandwidth can compensate for the lack of visual representation in a game.
Right.
So trying to completely translate those games from something more or less ethereal and then grounded by like dice rolls and character stats and everything, trying to compensate for that by making something that needs to be limited, it's never quite gonna match.
Well, I think the interesting change that I've seen lately, and then I'll shut up so that our guests can actually talk, is that there's been a ton of virtual tools coming out, getting crowdfunded, of which I've crowdfunded at least 3 of them, which are functionally tools to make your own campaigns, but in a virtual setting. So it's like you've got character models that are pre-generated, enemy models that are pre-generated, and then map tools, so you can functionally make your own Divinity campaign, but they don't provide like the campaign themselves, or they might provide like a very bare bones like example for you to kind of base off of. But I've seen a massive push towards that kind of content. I don't think anything's gone super mainstream outside of like, Divinity, Pillars of Eternity, some of the Pathfinder games that are, gamify or digital game versions of campaigns that they have. But I think that's kind of an interesting approach of, not trying to tackle the world, but instead almost give a framework for people to build their own content on.
I like that. And so you kind of get that sandbox thing. I did want to jump back to another game system that we touched on briefly that absolutely railroads you story-wise, but does a good job of capturing this kind of tabletop feel, was Pokemon, in all the different versions. And it really comes down to, because again, there's not much. You have the schools of magic and the abilities, so that does lend in some of that tabletop, counterplay RPG. But it's that connection to the characters, be they NPCs or PCs, playable characters, non-playable characters. You've got your Squirtle and you've got your Pikachu and you've got your Licky Tongue or whatever you have, and you develop this attachment to the character. And so, you use them so much, you interact with them so much through the game that you do have this thing. And so if something happens to that character, you care about it. And that is one thing that a lot of the more hardcore video games tend to miss out on, that the casual video games definitely pick up on. but that is a huge part of D&D. Is people become intensely attached to their characters, and that is a huge aspect of the game as well.
But yeah,
that's a huge point. Yeah.
But yeah, from a mechanical aspect, if you've ever played a video game that has a leveling mechanic, that came from TTRPGs. If you ever played a game that has, class progression, or you unlock abilities as you go, that came from TTRPGs. That those sort of mechanical things are, they firmly have their basis in these early TTRPGs, and I think that they actually translate better into a virtual space than they do at the table, because you have the computer there to do the math for you.
Yeah, that does help a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I ran into that a lot when I was playing Knights of the Old Republic, which is like, it's very upfront, or like old school Dragon Age, like original Dragon Age, or Baldur's Gate or something like that, where they say, like, they literally upfront, there's just like this brick of text that says, okay, we're doing dice rolls in the background. And then you never have to actually worry about the dice rolls. You just have to worry about your modifiers. Right. And the modifiers are all done correctly and accurately because it's done by a computer, and they're done autonomously, and all you have to worry about is, what do I want to upgrade to increase my chances of?
Mm-hmm.
So it's a little bit more elegant in terms of like being hands off, but there's something lost there a little bit to me.
Well, I think it's interesting going back to one of the things as a DM that's the hardest for me is, similarly, I don't play in person really at all anymore, but getting new people into even 5e can be a little bit cumbersome, because it's like, okay, here's this character sheet. They look at it and they're like, yeah, it's very easy to get overwhelmed, even in 5e, which is pretty streamlined. So having things like D&D Beyond is incredibly helpful, or those auto-populating character sheets where you just put in like the stuff that you really care about, which is a lot of the flavor, the abilities, the different things like that. I think that's super helpful. And to the point of video games, like a lot of video games do that just for you, so you don't need to worry about the number crunching and where does this impact a modifier and all of that stuff. And I think that's great. But actually, one thing that I think is interesting that I didn't know about until the prelude to this discussion, but I think relates to video games, is you mentioned microtransactions being at least something that people are concerned about being a future part of D&D.
Yeah.
And I think that's interesting for a few reasons, because one, D&D does kind of at the current moment not have a way to continue to invest in the system. So I'm not surprised Hasbro's like, how can we further monetize this game? And also, being a subscriber to D&D Beyond provides an amazing opportunity for them to basically come up with a software as a service model or games as a service model for D&D and keep milking people for money.
Yeah.
For lack of a better way of putting it. So
I'm sad about
that. Especially now that Wizards of the Coast has acquired D&D Beyond.
Yes.
They bought D&D Beyond several months ago.
Mm-hmm. And that's part of the issue. And we discussed also pre-roll, open D&D with that. And so people are kind of apprehensive of what Wizards of the Coast may do with D&D Beyond. I really loved it as a service. I still have it on my phone, because I can keep all my books on my phone. I don't have to, carry a library. Ian says he's got, almost $2,000 worth of books, and he's got this wonderful, beautiful library. But if he has to play somewhere, he's not packing that into his car. I can throw my library into my pocket and roll out. So if they push this monetization or microtransactions, which I'm pretty sure they will to some degree, I am apprehensive about it. I hope they don't overdo it. I hope they don't do like a Blizzard or an EA with it and just completely kill the experience.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%.
So much of that, I think. Sorry.
Hey,
Overtalk. Welcome back to Some Patches Required. Overtalk.
I blame lag on that one, Aaron. What were you saying? You go.
Well, I was gonna say, I think so much of like when you say ruining the experience, I think that is directly analogous to the stuff we talk about with video games all the time, where as long as you're not partitioning content, it's fine. If you want to pay for additional stuff, that's fine. But if there are very specific things, especially for like higher level players or more intense players, um, then at that point it becomes kind of gross.
Right.
So I don't have a problem. Like I want people to be paid for their work, but if you're going to partition necessary content behind microtransactions, at that point I start.
Yeah,
to
if you're gonna throw up some skins
get
or give me
grossed
some
out.
lore or give me, a shiny mod for my dice roll, I am great for paying for that. And if it's cool or if it goes to a charity thing, great. Blizzard does that very well with like a lot of their WoW pets they used to have, and it was nothing important. It was just a little fluffy thing you could get. It was kind of fun to have. And like I said, they'd be for different disasters or charities or whatever, blah, that's fine. Pay to win for like a lot of your mobile games is terrible. Another big flub that Blizzard had way back when was Diablo 3, and their real auction house was so abysmally poor.
Oh yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Where was I going? I had a point.
I broke Ian.
You did.
Oh my god, are you me? The number of times I have said that exact sentence, like I'll start a sentence and I'll end like 3 topics later and be like, I think I had a point at some point.
I think I found it.
Okay.
So I think that the most logical way that they're going to incorporate microtransactions or a paid subscription service in the next edition of Dungeons and Dragons would probably be having a paid service to allow you to import third-party content. That is what I'm thinking, because they already have all of the third-party content that is being published on the DM's Guild, and being able to have a subscription service, a premium subscription service that will allow you to import your DM's Guild purchases into D&D Beyond to use in your games. I think that pipeline, to me, makes the most sense as a money-grubbing way for them to go.
I could see that. The other thing I could see is right now Wizards of the Coast has something called Sword Coast Adventures, and they are quote official campaigns run by generally Wizards of the Coast approved DMs. So it's kind of like if you go and play Magic the Gathering at a store and you play, you get a score tally for whatever the season or the game is. So you can do, tournaments and stuff like that. You can play D&D officially, and I'm sure they'll have it so where if you want to pay so much money, they will keep your characters in store, and therefore you could play this character at any of these official functions, and then you can say, well, here's my character, and you can just pull it up on D&D Beyond, and everything will be very nicely packaged. And so if you want to build a new character, maybe like $1 to build and store a character for that. I could see him going that direction with it as well.
Yeah, I think, kind of my last knowledgeable thought on what you're talking about with the monetizing. I actually love D&D Beyond. I think it's weirdly, there's a lot of services that are out there where I have issues with it, and there are some very minor issues with like making homebrew content in D&D Beyond that are kind of annoying. But generally speaking, like I think the DM subscription is like $5 a month, maybe. It's pretty cheap. And you get, I think it's like up to 10 characters in a campaign. Everybody gets the same content that you already have. It just makes life so much easier, whether you're in, you're across the country or even in the same place, having access to it on your phone. It just makes everything so convenient. I think them further monetizing that service is what pops into mind. I just really hope with all these things you're talking about and also with D&D Beyond, they don't screw it up, because they really are kind of leading the charge with it. So there's nothing that's really solidified, at least that I know about, and feel free to educate me, that they can base things on. I feel like that's what kind of makes me nervous, if I'm being honest. I feel like they're going to try some things that are going to be really awful just to see what they can get away with. because I feel like that's how companies work. And
Well,
I
it's
just
how the
don't know
video
that
game
they
industry
have anything
works.
to base stuff on that people have gotten pissed about in the past.
Yeah, so I mean,
with this
they've
medium.
not come out with any official statements, and there is, I mean, everything, and pretty much everything we've discussed up to this point is part of it, but some collective pearl clutching, as it were. And again, I mean, we've just all seen, game companies take a great product and, overextend trying to squeeze finances out of it. And I totally get wanting to make money off a product, but we're all just worried that they are going to overextend and sour the experience.
Well, I think on that note, just looking at the time, we should probably start wrapping up. And in traditional SPR fashion, I think ending on something akin to loot boxes or microtransactions seems pretty appropriate.
Right.
Yeah. That it is a bizarrely congruous situation for us, because that is a lot of what we end up talking about most of the time. But I mean, I guess if you guys had any like final thoughts that you wanted to wrap up, any like real quick extra things that you wanted to get out before we get to your bona fides and how people can find you and your wonderful podcast, feel free to each drop those in right now.
I'm good. You got anything, Ian?
Nah, I think we're pretty good.
All right. Well then, where can your soon-to-be fans, supposing we drive enough traffic to you for that to be a going concern, where can we find you? And let us know how to get in contact with you and your show. Listen to you wherever you like. All
right. We are on basically all of the podcast aggregators. So if you search Undercommon Taste on any of them, we should be the one that pops up. We are
now. I'm gonna interrupt you for 1 sec,
okay,
just for a clarification, because this originally confused me. Undercommon is one word.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
That may be to people who may not understand the reference. That may be a factor. So it is Undercommon is one word.
Yes.
And then Taste.
Undercommon is one word. It is a play. It is actually a play on the language Undercommon from the D&D games and the in-game book Uncommon Taste from the Elder Scrolls games.
I didn't know this
Delightful.
Elder Scrolls reference.
Yes.
I did not notice the Elder Scrolls reference.
Yeah,
either.
it's one of the.
So I'm glad that I got that clarification, but I'm also glad
It's one of the the cooking reference books you can find in the Elder Scrolls game, particularly in Skyrim. Yeah.
I believe it's also in Oblivion.
Oh, okay.
But yes.
I never found it in Oblivion, but awesome.
But yeah, so the podcast name is Undercommon Taste. Undercommon is all one word. We are available on all of the major and some of the minor podcast aggregators. We still have a presence on the flaming husk of Twitter. You can find us at UCT Homebrew.
I think you missed.
Sorry,
I think you meant to say flaming musk of Twitter.
That wasn't the pun I was going for, but I appreciate it.
Oh, sorry. Okay, repeat your handle. I'm so sorry.
You can find us at UCT Homebrew, because at Undercommon Taste was one character too long, and I refused to be at Undercommon Taste. But we are also on the other socials: Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, Twitch. Search Undercommon Taste. We are also on Mastodon, Undercommon Taste at dice.camp. I haven't been doing a whole lot on Mastodon because it's confusing and scares me. Letting my inner Luddite out.
I was gonna say that's something old people say.
That is something old people say. But I am a 78-year-old living in a 33-year-old's body.
This is also very true.
Okay. And we are we are also on Patreon, patreon.com/Undercommon Taste. That's where we put most of our homebrew content. A lot of it is free. So everything that we create on our show with our guests, a lot of the stuff that we create between ourselves on the show, all of that ends up going up for free on our Patreon. And we have a Discord. If you'd like to chat with us on Discord, I'll give Aaron and Zach the link for our Discord so you can come over and chat with us.
Yeah, and we will be posting all of the links that we are provided in our show notes. So if you want to catch up with the Undercommon Taste crew, feel free to check out the show notes beneath this episode whenever this episode goes up. I wish I had a definitive date, but I wildly do not. So I guess that's kind of our wrap up. Unless you guys had anything else, I'd just like to honestly thank you for giving up the time, waking up and coming to chat with the two of us dinguses. And I'd also just it was a really fun conversation. My favorite episodes to record are the ones that are just actually really fun conversations. And this has been one of them. So thank you guys so much for being on the show.
Yeah, no, thank you
Thanks
for having us. Yeah, definitely. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for hopping on. Everything that Aaron said, but so you all can get on with your lives. I'll just paraphrase in that way. Thanks for coming on this show. Thanks, Ian. Thanks, James.
All right. Catch you guys later.
Well, thanks, everybody. If you're still around to this point, before we get to our normal thank yous, I just wanted to say thank you to Undercommon Taste for jumping on the show and, helping to educate not only us, but our listeners about tabletop RPGs and D&D. We really appreciate it. I know it was a long time in the making of me going back and forth with Ian and James over Twitter. So that being said, thank you. And a quick thank you as well to eDougie Art, who helped us with our amazing logo, album art, whatever I decide to call it on the particular day that we are recording. As always, you can find her amazing work at eDougie Art on both Etsy and Instagram with the same handle.
Yes, of course. Huge thank you to eDougie Art, and another thank you from me in my voice from, and to the guys from Undercommon Taste. I really enjoyed our conversation. I hope you all did too. It's something to appreciate. And if we get even just one person to remove a little bit of the stigma from it, that's fantastic because they are a grand time. But the other person I would be remiss not to thank is, of course, our fantastic theme music author? Man, we're doing a good job at this. That would be Beach Girl. Beach Girl provided our intro and outro music. You can find them on Spotify, Bandcamp, or wherever else fine music can be located in the digital space.
We love Beach Girl.
This is true. And I guess with that having been said, we're good to go, right?
We're good to go, Aaron. Lead us out.
But word of wisdom, and remember, make sure to cook your chicken to 165 degrees internal temperature to avoid catching salmonella.
It's important. We don't want you to get food poisoning while listening to Some Patches Required. We don't condone that.
Well, I've definitely gotten food poisoning while editing Some Patches Required. But at risk of doing so by eating my mic a little bit too hard, I'm going to say goodbye.
Goodbye, everybody. Have a good night, you sexy, sexy human. All right, I'm done. Bye.
Oh, don't say that on the podcast.